Today we're going to talk about beginning an 8-column worksheet for a merchandise business. Before we get started, it's kind of important to know that a worksheet is used to plan adjustments and summarize the information necessary to prepare financial statements. So once again, we're beginning the process of being able to summarize the financial statements. When we enter a trial balance on a worksheet, to prepare the trial balance on a worksheet, they must be entered. All the trial balances come from the balance of the appropriate ledger. So in this case, it's cash, and the balance amount is going to be entered in the appropriate part. The debit balance on the cash account is going to be a debit entry in the trial balance. So you're not creating any new debits or credits when you are entering a trial balance, but rather you are just transferring the numbers from one place to another. If a general ledger account has a zero balance, it is still entered on the worksheet, as it may have a balance later on after we do the adjustments. So So then let's take a look at a real quick example of how to prepare it. So we have a partially completed worksheet for Brandsman Amusement Company as given below. 4 general ledger accounts are shown. In this case, we have supplies, office, accounts payable, purchase, discount, salary expense. Before we start, now normally you would just get these from the ledger, but this is a little bit of a different transaction. But before we start, it's important to know what type of account they are and what their normal balances are, because that will help us ultimately enter them onto the worksheet. If you look at supplies office is an asset account. Its account balance will have a debit normal balance, which means it will be a debit entry on the trial balance. Accounts payable is our liability account. It has a credit normal balance. That will be then a credit entry on the trial balance column. Purchase discount is a contra account to purchases, which is an expense account. So therefore, it will have a credit normal balance. So on the trial balance column, you will see a credit entry for the purchases discount. And then salary expense is an expense account, and you'll see a debit normal balance there. So if we were to take our supplies office account, and if we were to create the trial balance, all we would do is we would take the 521098. Well, first we would enter supplies office, obviously, in the account title column, and then we would take the 5298, and since it is a debit normal balance, we would enter it as a debit in the trial balance. Now, after we've entered the trial balances, now we want to talk a little bit about how do we adjust when we make adjustments. Now, adjustments are going to be made by a merchandising business are pretty much going to revolve around 6 categories for the most part. There will be some variations. Supplies, prepaid insurance, merchandise inventory, uncollectible accounts, depreciation expense, and federal income tax expense. For this one that we're going to work on is we're going to actually work on supplies. In dealing with our supplies account, we notice that we have to make the following adjustment because our ending balance is $701.19. So what we're going to do is we need to ask some key questions, and these questions in blue I think are the most important things to understand in the adjustments. What is the balance of the supplies account? Well, to find the balance of the supplies account, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to actually go back to our trial balance column, and we're going to have to look at our supplies stores balance, and you'll see that it's 4349.44. And what that means is basically we started this fiscal period at 4349 with 44 with a balance on our supplies store account. So the next question we ask ourselves is, what should the balance be for supplies account? Well, the balance should be 701.19. So then we have to then ultimately ask ourselves what must be done. Well, if we started with $4,349 in supplies for the store, and we end with $701 in supplies, it's pretty obvious that you've noticed that the supplies have decreased. So we need to decrease our supplies store, and so we need to figure out really how much did we use. Well, we started with $4,349.44. We ended with $701.19 worth of supplies for the store. So that means that we used $3,648.25 worth of supplies. So now that we've figured out how much supplies we've used, now we have to make the appropriate adjusting entries. Well, we have two different accounts that we're going to use. The first account that we're going to use is actually going to be supplies expense store, because that's going to really show what we used. And then ultimately supplies store. We need to ultimately decrease the value. Now, if you remember in the beginning, you'll see the same 4 questions be answered again. But in the beginning, you notice that we had a balance of $4,349.44. We have an ending balance of $701.19. So basically what we need to do is we need to show how much did we use. Well, supply store is an asset account. We need to decrease the asset account, and since we're going to decrease the asset account, we're going to decrease it with an adjustment of $3,648.25, or the amount of supplies that we used. And then to balance that out, we're going to use our debit entry of our supplies expense of $3,648.25. As we move into the worksheet, we're not going to use the trial balance column anymore. Rather, we're going to use the adjustment column. And you'll see that we will take we'll do the first one with our supplies store, which is $3,648.25. We will put it as a credit because that is the adjustment. That's showing how much we used. And then we'll use supplies expense store, $3,648.25 as a debit because it is an expense account, and expense accounts have a debit normal balance. Now, the question might come up, why don't we use $701 as our entry? $701.19 will show up as an entry, but it will show up later on when we talk about filling out the balance sheet columns with that. So that's why that doesn't show up, because the adjustment columns needs to show how much it was used. So basically what we will be doing is we'll be taking the trial balance minus the adjustments, or plus the adjustments in some case, but in this case minus the adjustments, and we will ultimately then get to our balance sheet account balance will be supplies store will be $701.19.